What if I told you that everything you believed in is a lie? For a long time, it was believed that the outcome of great historical conflicts was always decided by vast masses of people and years of preparation. However, sometimes it all comes down to a single open field, a few minutes of critical tension, and a single tactical decision that changes the course of continental history.
Imagine that atmosphere of despair, when every breath could be your last.
And the looming threat seemed insurmountable. After an exhausting retreat from the capital, a handful of survivors found themselves trapped in a vast valley facing an impenetrable enemy wall. In today's video, we'll take a detailed look at all the hidden circumstances that were left out of the official history and see what happened through the eyes of eyewitnesses. Be sure to watch the video until the end. Be sure to watch the video until the end.
You'll learn how a single precise action shattered the entire command structure of a massive army.
And completely rewrote the fate of an entire empire. Like this video right now. If you love exploring real historical turning points, subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you don't miss our next videos. Get comfortable, pour yourself something tasty, and let's figure this out together. Are you ready for the shocking truth? The retreat from the great city on the lake was the greatest logistical and strategic failure of that time. Hundreds of people lost all their equipment, provisions, and organizational structure during the nighttime crossing over the destroyed dams. They moved blindly through unfamiliar territory, trying to find a safe route to the coast. This march deprived them of their main advantage: tactical control of space and the initiative. Instead of an organized unit on the roads, an exhausted group was moving, whose sole goal was simply not to stop. The surrounding landscape offered no cover or opportunities for maneuver. The Otumba Valley was a wide open space, devoid of dense forests or protective high ground. For the exhausted men, such terrain meant complete vulnerability to any organized pursuit.
The open terrain made it impossible to use narrow passes to hold back superior forces.
Every kilometer covered was a struggle due to the lack of drinking water and constant tension. Nature itself became a barrier on the way to the safety of Allied territory. At this point, the Expedition Command had completely lost contact with its reserves. Intelligence could not provide accurate data on the pursuers' movements due to the loss of mobile units. The men marched in tight formation, constantly scanning the horizon in anticipation of the inevitable encounter. The lack of information placed heavy psychological pressure on every participant in this trek. The group leader understood that any pause could prove to be a fatal mistake. They pressed forward solely through inner discipline and the strict organization of the march. The surrounding landscape remained deceptively calm throughout several days of travel. The few settlements along their route turned out to be completely deserted, with no signs of recent habitation by local residents. This emptiness was evidence of a large-scale mobilization in the region and preparations for a major confrontation. Experienced tacticians in the ranks of the retreating forces read these invisible signals of the approaching storm perfectly. They forced the column to maintain maximum speed despite the complete depletion of internal resources. Every mile brought them closer to the border of friendly lands, but at the same time narrowed the ring of the invisible encirclement. At the opposite end of the valley, a massive movement of people began. At first, it looked like a slight change in the color of the landscape itself, blending into the morning mist. But as the sun rose, the strict geometric organization of these lines became clear. This was not a scattered mob of pursuers, but a pre-planned and organized interception line. Local forces had used the enemy's retreat to gather armies from all the provinces under their control.
They had blocked the only accessible route leading to the Allied territories of Tlaxcala.
The scale of the deployed forces defied a quick count, filling the entire visible space from edge to edge. The organized ranks shimmered with the bright colors of uniforms and tall banners. This visual wall served not only as a tactical barrier, but also as a powerful psychological weapon. It demonstrated absolute control over the territory and a readiness to end the pursuit with a single decisive action. For 1,000 weary people, this sight signaled the end of their long march. There was nowhere to retreat, and the geography of the valley made it impossible to bypass such a defensive line. The situation demanded an immediate risk assessment and the development of a new plan of action. The commander understood that the traditional tactic of holding the line would not work here due to the difference in numbers. This moment marked the beginning of the most tense hour in the history of their campaign. I'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think about such hopeless historical situations? Share your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the continuation of this story. I discovered this by chance while studying archives on the formation of armies from that period. The enemy's formation on the Otumba plain was not a chaotic cluster of forces. It was a complex, multi-tiered structure. In the front ranks stood lightly armed units whose task was to wear down the enemy from a distance. Behind them were dense ranks of heavy infantry, ready to absorb any frontal assault. This entire mass was divided into distinct rectangular formations, controlled by visual and auditory signals. This organization allowed the massive army to move like a single, well-coordinated machine. The flanks of this formation slowly curved forward, forming a giant crescent shape. This tactic was designed to completely encircle a small enemy group and deprive it of any room to maneuver. The gradual tightening of this crescent was intended to cut off the unit's escape routes. Every step of the attacking side was carefully calculated and synchronized with neighboring units. To those surrounded, it looked as if the very edges of the valley had begun to shift toward the center. The pressure was applied slowly, without sudden surges, so as not to disrupt their own formation. At the center of this advancing front was the elite command group. They could be distinguished by their tall, richly decorated flags and the complex structures behind them. This group did not take direct part in the initial clashes, maintaining an observer position. All tactical decisions originated from here and were instantly relayed down the chain of command to the flanks. The central location provided the best view of the field and protection against accidental breakthroughs. This very point served as the nerve center of the entire colossal war machine. First contact occurred along the entire perimeter of the square almost simultaneously. The advancing waves crashed against the dense formation of spears, trying to find a weak spot in the defense.
The defenders worked in unison, replacing their exhausted comrades in the second line.
This rotation allowed them to maintain a constant defensive density in the most dangerous sections. However, the continuous pressure demanded a colossal expenditure of energy from every participant. The square began to slowly deform under the weight of the superior forces. The assault came in waves. Exhausted units withdrew, making way for fresh reserves. This tactic of constantly refreshing the attacking forces was the main trump card of the massive army. The besieged, on the other hand, had no opportunity for proper rest or to rotate their personnel. Each new wave seemed more powerful than the last, testing the defenders' endurance to the limit. The defensive line would bend inward, then straighten again thanks to titanic efforts. Maintaining the integrity of the formation became the sole condition for the group's physical survival. The density of players on the field reached such a level that movement became difficult for both sides. This deprived the attacking side of its speed advantage, turning the clash into static positional pressure. However, this very congestion made any organized breakthrough from the square impossible. Both sides found themselves locked in an exhausting standoff of attrition. The defenders' resources were dwindling with every minute of this continuous contact.
It was becoming clear that passive defense had a strict time limit.
An analysis of movements revealed the entire army's clear dependence on signals from the center. Each wave of attack began only after visual confirmation from the command group. This was classic centralized command, effective but with a single critical point of failure. If you were the commander, what decision would you make in such a desperate situation? Are you ready to learn the shocking truth about how this army's invisible communications network was built in the next chapter? The secret that people pay thousands for lies in the ability to read the structure of an enemy's command system. The enemy army on the Otumba plain functioned as a giant living organism with a unified nervous system. In an era without radio communication, commanding such masses of people depended entirely on visual markers. These markers were the enormous banners and standards fastened to the backs of unit commanders. Every color, pattern, and height of the flag conveyed a specific order to hundreds of soldiers. The loss or fall of such a standard meant an immediate breakdown in communication between the center and the periphery. The central hub of this network was the commander-in-chief, who stood on a raised platform at the center of the formation. Towering above him was the tallest and most conspicuous standard, which served as a landmark for the entire valley. Surrounding him was his personal guard, providing protection and relaying commands to adjacent sectors. As long as this flag remained upright, the army maintained its confidence and structural integrity. It was not merely a symbol of authority, but a functional tool for coordinating the most complex maneuvers.
The entire tactic of encirclement and wave attacks depended on the stability of this central point.
The commander of the surrounded unit, observing the battlefield, realized this structural flaw. He understood that fighting thousands of rank-and-file soldiers was pointless and would only lead to complete exhaustion. The real target was not on the perimeter of their defensive square, but at the very center of the enemy formation. Eliminating the rank-and-file soldiers did not change the overall picture, as new reserves immediately took their place. But destroying the command center could instantly paralyze the entire army. It was a cold, analytical conclusion reached in the midst of the incredible tension of a stalemate. The problem was that the command center was located behind dense ranks of elite infantry. Reaching it meant breaking through several echelons of a deeply echeloned defense. For an infantry formation, such a task was absolutely impossible due to the colossal difference in mass. A breakthrough tool was needed, capable of pushing back the lines and quickly covering the distance to the target. Only a small but extremely fast strike force could serve as this tool. The decision was made instantly to use the last mobile reserve for a precise surgical strike. The horsemen formed a classic wedge, with the commander himself at the tip. This decision was dictated by the need for personal control over the direction of the strike. They checked their equipment, removing everything unnecessary and focusing on maintaining a tight formation. The target was clearly defined, the golden standard rising above the sea of people in the center of the valley. The distance to it seemed enormous, given the density of the enemy ranks in this short stretch. But there was simply no other way to turn the tactical situation around. The infantry holding the front received the signal to briefly open a passage. They forcefully pushed back the attacking front lines, creating a narrow, straight corridor. This corridor lasted literally a moment, but that time proved sufficient. The strike force, at full speed, broke out of the defensive perimeter. Their appearance outside the perimeter came as a complete tactical surprise to the advancing forces.
No one expected offensive action from a unit entrenched in a tight circular defense.
This breakthrough changed the entire geometry of the battlefield and the tactical balance of forces. The enemy's attention was instantly shifted from besieging the square to closing the breach. The defenders in the center could breathe a little easier as the pressure on the perimeter temporarily eased. The entire focus of this grand confrontation narrowed down to the movement of a single small wedge. If you enjoy our detailed analysis of this tactical operation, please like this video. The hidden truth that everyone keeps quiet about is that huge armies are extremely slow to maneuver. When the strike force penetrated deep into the enemy's ranks, the inertia of the massive force kicked in. The elite units standing in the second and third lines did not have time to quickly close ranks. They had been trained to advance in synchronized waves, not to react to a pinpoint breakthrough from within. This tactical inflexibility allowed the wedge to cover the first half of the distance with minimal loss of speed. The element of surprise became the very factor that temporarily compensated for the huge difference in numbers. However, as they approached the center, the density of the enemy formation increased sharply. This is where the best units were stationed, whose sole task was to fiercely defend the command. They quickly realized the direction of the threat and began to form a dense wall in front of their leader. The wedge's movement began to slow as it became increasingly difficult to break through the solid mass of people. The momentum of the initial surge had been exhausted, and a brutal, forceful push began, inch by inch. The group found itself in the very heart of enemy territory, completely cut off from its own forces. The group commander at the tip of the wedge constantly assessed the distance to the main standard. The target was already close. Its details were clearly visible through the thick clouds of dust. But it was precisely this final stretch that was the most heavily defended and difficult to traverse on the entire field. The horsemen had to use the sheer mass of their armored companions to push apart the dense ranks. The wedge formation began to deform under the powerful lateral pressure from the defenders in the center. Maintaining a unified direction of movement required incredible physical and organizational effort. The breakthrough wedge nearly came to a halt, meeting fierce resistance from the last line of the personal guard. The advance turned into a slow process of forcing the enemy out of their defensive positions. The group's leader decided to concentrate all remaining pressure on a single narrow point. Instead of a broad front, they formed a dense column, directing their entire mass precisely toward the center. This maneuver allowed them to breach the seemingly monolithic formation of trained defenders. The commander found himself within direct visual range of the enemy's commander-in-chief. The mutual recognition of these two figures occurred almost instantly. Both sides realized that this very point in space and these few minutes would decide everything. Around them, the massive crowds continued to surge, but for these two groups, time stood still. The commander-in-chief attempted to issue an order for an emergency regrouping of his personal guard, but the density of the crowd around him was so high that it was impossible to execute the maneuver quickly. The protective formation that was supposed to shield him had become an insurmountable trap. The assault group made its final charge, covering the remaining decisive meters. Their movement was precise and uncompromising, directed exclusively at the standard-bearer. The guards tried to intercept the attackers, but the momentum of the narrow wedge was still powerful. The guards' formation was finally shattered by this powerful, focused pressure from the horsemen. The commander of the breakthrough found himself right on top of the target of his incredibly daring tactical operation. The outcome of the hours-long stalemate now depended on a single, precise, and swift movement. The command system of the massive army was a split second away from total collapse. All the complex multi-tiered formations, flanking maneuvers, and trained reserves had become utterly meaningless. How vulnerable can a complex system be when it is tightly tied to a single central node? Have you ever wondered how often in history a single small detail has changed the course of massive global processes? Guess what happened next in the following chapter when this complex mechanism failed? The physical confrontation at the center of the control circle was extremely swift. The commander of the attacking group focused all his attention on the man carrying the main standard. With a powerful, directed movement, he broke through the last line of stunned bodyguards. This action was devoid of any unnecessary theatrics. It was purely functional. The objective wasn't a protracted battle, but the rapid neutralization of a key connecting element. The strike force acted as a single instrument, securing those precious seconds for their leader. The enemy commander-in-chief, clad in heavy ceremonial regalia, was deprived of the necessary mobility. His high status did not call for participation in direct mobile physical combat. The cumbersome structure of the standard behind him made a quick retreat or maneuvering impossible. At that moment, the very complexity and incredible richness of his equipment worked against him. He found himself a stationary target facing a highly mobile and extremely motivated opponent. The difference in approach to maneuverability reached its historical peak at that moment. The decisive action lasted, in reality, no more than a few brief seconds. The breakthrough commander reached his target and delivered a precise, focused tactical strike. This thrust was aimed at disrupting the structural integrity of the standard-bearer's position. The commander-in-chief lost his balance, and his complex ceremonial structure tilted sharply. The strike force immediately supported their leader, isolating the target from any attempts by the guards to come to his aid. The command center of the vast army ceased to exist as an organized, functional structure. The space around the standard's point of impact quickly filled with disoriented rank-and-file soldiers. Without clear orders from the center, the flank commanders ceased further transmission of signals. A wave of deep confusion began to spread rapidly from the epicenter to the edges of the vast formation. This process resembled a complete power outage in a highly complex electrical circuit. The mechanism, which had been working flawlessly just a minute ago, began to suffer fatal malfunctions at every level. The perfectly even ranks of the advancing troops began to break down and mingle uncontrollably with one another. The strike force began a rapid retreat, cutting through the enemy's disorganized ranks. Now they faced not a disciplined, trained army, but a bewildered, massive crowd. Their retreat was swift, as the resistance was entirely chaotic. They carried the captured standard triumphantly, holding it high for their weary comrades to see. The return to the safety of the square was much easier than their initial, arduous breakthrough. The ring of infantry instantly closed behind them, restoring its monolithic, reliable defense. The Otumba plain witnessed an unprecedented tactical collapse. A force capable of wiping a small detachment off the face of the earth was defeated by a single, well-targeted strike. This proved that flexibility and speed of decision-making are more important than numerical superiority. The turning point culminated in a complete reversal of roles on the battlefield. The encircled forces became the victors, while the pursuers turned into an uncontrollable mob. The next stage was inevitable. The massive army began its retreat. A secret passed down from generation to generation states: if you break the foundation, you will destroy the entire building. The collapse of a massive army does not happen instantly. It is a process of cascading breakdowns in communication. As soon as the central reference point disappeared, the flanks lost their sense of position within the overall formation. The left and right edges of the crescent, which were supposed to close the ring, halted their advance. They began waiting for confirmation signals that could no longer be sent on this battlefield. These precious minutes of delay allowed the defenders to finally stabilize their tactical position. The information vacuum was quickly filled with growing and uncontrollable panic. Rumors of the commander-in-chief's death spread through the ranks faster than any official military orders. In the conditions of an extremely dense formation, panic tends to intensify many times over as it is passed along. Soldiers in the rear ranks, unable to see what was happening in the center, quickly succumbed to the general mood of alarm. The army's structure began to irrevocably disintegrate into separate, small, and independent units. Each local commander now cared only about the physical survival of his men. The sense of imminent victory that had reigned among the ranks of the attackers that morning had completely evaporated. It was replaced by a bitter realization of their own vulnerability in the face of an incomprehensible and rapidly advancing threat. How could a small, exhausted detachment destroy the center of their invincible and glorious army? This question robbed them of their confidence and shattered the morale of even the most experienced units. The psychological advantage now lay unquestionably with the small square of defenders. They stood motionless, watching as the colossal enemy machine tore itself apart. The process of retreating such a vast mass of people created its own colossal logistical problems. The narrow exits from the valley quickly filled with retreating units, creating impassable traffic jams. This further exacerbated the disorganization and prevented them from regrouping for a new assault. The army, which had arrived as a single well-oiled machine, was leaving the field as a disjointed, buzzing crowd. Their gleaming equipment and tall banners now seemed utterly out of place as relics of a lost campaign. The Otumba Valley was reverting to its original, quiet, and completely desolate state. That day vividly demonstrated the full power of the decapitation concept in military tactics. A precise, surgical strike at a weak point proved far more effective than hours of frontal pressure. The entire might of the gigantic army was reduced to nothing because of a single error in the command's positioning. This strategy has gone down in world history as a classic example of a brilliant asymmetric response. A small, highly organized group was able to completely outmaneuver a mass of thousands with a rigid hierarchy. Victory was achieved not through physical strength, but through absolute superiority in analyzing the situation. This turning point had colossal long-term consequences for both sides of the conflict. It shattered the established myth of the invincibility of massive local armies in open terrain. It demonstrated to the unit's regional allies that political support for this group held immense strategic significance. This was far from the end of the war, but it marked the end of a phase of grueling retreat and vulnerability. The initiative in this global continental conflict had shifted hands once again, and for the long term. What do you think is more important in a critical situation? The number of soldiers or sound strategic planning? The situation in the region changed dramatically in just a few hours. What seemed like an inevitable disaster in the morning turned into a strategic success by evening. How often in history does a single day reshape the geopolitical landscape of an entire continent? What do you think is more important in a critical situation? The number of soldiers or sound strategic planning? Want to learn the secret that changed the expedition's plans in the next chapter? After the enemy front collapsed, the landscape of the Otumba Plain ceased to be a deadly trap. The open space that had threatened complete encirclement early that morning now provided safety. It was now completely impossible to organize any ambushes or hidden maneuvers in this area. The detachment regrouped into marching order, leaving behind the grueling experience of the static square. Their pace increased noticeably, despite the extreme depletion of their internal resources over many days. The psychological boost from their incredible rescue gave the men entirely new strength for the march. The main goal now was to reach the borders of Tlaxcala, an independent territory hostile to the local empire. It was there that the expedition could count on a long respite, replenishment of supplies, and political support. Navigation was carried out using familiar landmarks as the terrain gradually became more familiar. Reconnaissance groups once again moved far ahead, monitoring the entire route of the column's advance. However, there were absolutely no signs of pursuit along the entire vast stretch of the journey. The enemy was too demoralized to quickly organize a new line of interception. Logistics remained the most serious problem for the exhausted command. Supplies of food and clean drinking water were critically low after the loss of the supply trains in the capital. They had to rely entirely on foraging in small abandoned settlements along the route. The discipline of rationing the resources they found was maintained at the strictest and most uncompromising level. Preserving the combat effectiveness of the group's core remained the detachment commander's absolute priority. Every member of the expedition fully understood the vital necessity of these strict measures of self-restraint. In the capital of Tlaxcala, the detachment was granted much-needed time for a long rest and regrouping. The primary task was to restore the men's physical condition and take inventory of the remaining equipment. It turned out that material losses were colossal and needed to be replenished immediately. Local skilled craftsmen were immediately enlisted to repair armor and forge new polearms. Forges operated at full capacity, adapting European military technologies to local resources. This period became a striking example of a unique military-industrial synthesis between two completely different cultures. The expedition commander wasted no time, launching intensive and complex diplomatic efforts. He held daily meetings lasting several hours with the elders of the allied cities, planning the future structure of the campaign. His main brilliant idea was to create a broad political coalition of cities dissatisfied with the empire's central authority. The victory on the plain clearly demonstrated the vulnerability of the metropolis's massive military command system. This logical argument resonated strongly with independent regional and ambitious leaders. A solid political foundation for a full-scale return to the Valley of the Lakes had been firmly laid. The recovery period in Tlaxcala became a turning point and the most critical moment of the entire campaign. The retreat officially ended, giving way to a phase of strategic logistical planning and the buildup of forces. The miraculous rescue on the open field transformed into a clear political and military plan of action. The detachment fully restored its high status as a key player on the region's political map. The Allies' infrastructure provided the necessary strong rear for the upcoming large-scale military operations. The Valley of Lakes was already preparing for a new, even more devastating phase of the continental confrontation. Rethinking logistics became the most important lesson learned from all previous failures and retreats. The expedition command came to the unequivocal conclusion that it was impossible to control the lake capital without controlling the waterway itself. The idea of a direct assault along the narrow dams was rejected as tactically untenable and extremely dangerous. An incredibly ambitious engineering concept emerged: to build their own fleet to completely blockade the city from the water. This innovative solution changed the very nature of the impending siege, transforming it into a strict naval blockade. No one had ever attempted to implement a project of such a gigantic scale so deep into the continent. Implementing this ambitious project required completely non-standard logistics chains and solutions. The ships were to be designed as modular structures in the safe mountains of Tlaxcala. Then, these enormous modules were to be transported dozens of kilometers to the shores of the lake by foot carriers. Metal parts, nails, and rigging had been carefully preserved since the first ships were dismantled on the coast. Timber for the hulls was harvested en masse from local forests and quickly processed through the joint efforts of carpenters. It was a colossal infrastructure project, requiring rigorous, months-long coordination of thousands of people. In parallel with shipbuilding, The systematic economic isolation of the enemy's capital began. Allied forces embarked on a methodical and ruthless capture of small satellite towns around the vast lake. This strategy of nibbling away at the periphery methodically deprived the metropolis of its food and vital resource base. The city, located on an island, was extremely dependent on massive daily shipments from the mainland. By cutting these fragile supply lines, the coalition created ideal conditions for a deep internal crisis. The tactic of small, sequential steps proved more effective than any attempts at an immediate, all-out land battle. The successful completion of the ship modules marked the beginning of the final phase of preparations for the siege. Tens of thousands of hardy porters formed a gigantic marching column stretching for many miles. They stubbornly carried heavy frames, flat planks, and complex mechanisms on their shoulders across steep mountain passes. The march itself was a vivid demonstration of the incredible organizational strength of the newly formed alliance. The delivery went off without a hitch, and the axes of hundreds of builders clattered loudly along the lake's shores. The outlines of small but highly maneuverable wooden brigantines began to take shape rapidly against the backdrop of the water. Inside the besieged island capital, the situation was exacerbated not only by the blockade, but also by an invisible, terrifying threat. An epidemic of an unknown disease, brought in from outside, was spreading rapidly and mercilessly amid the overcrowded conditions. It was swiftly decimating the ranks of the defenders and demoralizing the civilian population more effectively than any siege machinery. The life support systems of the vast city simply could not cope with such a colossal, unforeseen burden. The empire was rapidly weakening from within, permanently losing its finest commanders and most experienced administrators. This was the only factor that neither of the warring parties could fully control. The ceremonial launch of the brigantine fleet permanently and irrevocably shifted the balance of power in the region. Equipped with sturdy sails and small cannons, they completely and unchallenged dominated the open waters. Local light transport boats were unable to offer them any serious tactical resistance whatsoever. The capital's communication with the outside continental world was severed completely and irrevocably. The siege naturally entered its most active, methodical, and destructive phase. The ring around the great and once invincible city on the lake closed completely. The capital had turned into a completely isolated island fortress, deprived of any hope of outside help. The gigantic empire had physically shrunk to the size of a single island, torn apart by internal crisis and a brutal siege. A single man's decision on the dusty field of Otumba had set in motion a process that inevitably led to this point. A complex chain of events, logistics, diplomacy, and engineering innovations converged at a single, final, historical juncture. The outcome of this grand, months-long siege was destined to forever alter the political map of an entire hemisphere. The world stood on the very threshold of a completely new historical era. The siege of the island city was the logical culmination of all the coalition's massive logistical efforts. Fierce fighting raged for every single block, every stone building, and every canal within the city walls. The defenders showed incredible tenacity, desperately holding their capital to the last available resource. The attackers systematically and methodically destroyed the city's architecture to deprive the enemy of any cover or footholds. The space for defense narrowed relentlessly with each passing day of this unrelenting pressure on all fronts. Palaces and temples quickly turned to ruins, becoming nothing more than building material for filling in the water barriers. A fleet of agile brigantines continued to maintain extremely tight control over the waterways, blocking any attempts at evacuation or supply delivery. Their technical maneuverability allowed them to respond very quickly to any clusters of enemy boats. Control of the water proved to be an absolutely decisive factor in maintaining the tightness of the siege ring. The engineering strategy, developed far away in the mountains of Tlaxcala, fully justified the bold hopes placed upon it. Without these mobile floating fortresses, a land assault across the narrow dams would have dragged on for many years. The fleet became the very key to the impregnable castle that locked away the rebellious and proud capital. The internal situation of the besieged city had reached a critical point of humanitarian exhaustion. The lack of fresh water, since the most important aqueducts had been destroyed at the very beginning of the siege, became the main problem. Severe famine and the aftermath of a terrible epidemic had completely sapped the physical strength of the steadfast defenders. However, their strict organizational structure continued, by some miracle, to function right on the ruins of their civilization. The city's command desperately tried to coordinate the defense of the last fortified sectors in the north of the island. It was a completely desperate resistance by a system that flatly refused to acknowledge its defeat. The breakthrough of the last fragile line of defense occurred simultaneously from the water and from the land. Brigantines completely blocked the escape routes by boat, while the infantry began a methodical and brutal sweep of the territory. The city's command structure finally collapsed, exactly repeating the scenario that had played out on the Otumba plain. The defenders' leaders attempted to secretly leave the island on a hidden flotilla, but were quickly intercepted by a patrol ship. This capture became a deeply symbolic and de facto turning point in the entire months-long, grueling siege. Without their high command, the remnants of the defense very quickly laid down their arms. A heavy, deafening, and empty silence reigned where the great and once bustling city had stood. The grandiose architecture that had captivated the imagination of the first expeditions had completely ceased to exist. The island's landscape had changed beyond recognition due to massive destruction and the total filling in of the canals. The center of power shifted abruptly, and now all rules were strictly dictated by the Expeditionary Corps administration. A complex process of profound transformation of the continent began, involving a complete change of elites and cultural paradigms. This global process would stretch on for decades, but its irreversibility became evident on this very historic day. The old world was completely dismantled, along with its island capital on the lake. The long journey from the expedition's near total collapse to its absolute triumph was finally complete. The commander's decision to break through the lines and destroy the standard on the plain saved them from certain doom. The construction of a mobile fleet in the mountains provided a real opportunity to capture the impregnable city on the water. This is an instructive story about how high intelligence, iron will, and precise organization can overturn any mathematical calculation. The victors immediately began planning new expeditions and the construction of a new capital right on the site of the old one. The historical global trajectory had been confidently set, and the journey along it was only just beginning. The historical scale of events is measured not by the number of participants, but by the depth of their consequences. What happened on the Otumba plain was a relatively local clash by the strict standards of world history. However, this very brief period became a point of divergence for the development of the two clashing civilizations. Had the small strike force failed to reach the center of the enemy formation, the expedition would have been completely annihilated. This would have guaranteed the preservation of the previous balance of power on the continent for many decades to come. The region's development would have followed a completely different historical, political, and technological path. The success of this incredible operation demonstrated the superiority of adaptive tactics over static and outdated doctrines. The enemy's army was ideal for resolving routine regional conflicts and dominating weaker neighbors. but it proved completely unprepared for the asymmetric actions of a small but highly motivated enemy group. The inability of their system to function without a central hub of visual control became its main and fatal flaw. This important lesson on the importance of decentralizing chains of command is relevant when analyzing any complex structures. The fragility of gigantic systems in the face of targeted attacks was brilliantly proven empirically. The expedition commander's spectacular diplomatic triumph following the battle completely determined the success of the entire campaign. The ability to convert tactical survival into strategic political capital is a hallmark of truly outstanding leadership. He was able to confidently convince his allies of the inevitability of the old empire's fall, using the captured standard as an argument. The formation of a broad coalition made it easy to compensate for the lack of his own manpower for a larger-scale siege. The divide and conquer policy was brilliantly implemented in practice with maximum managerial efficiency. Skillful management of the conflicting interests of local elites became the key to global dominance. At the same time, the consequences of the conflict led to a very deep regional demographic crisis. Drastic changes in supply chains and new, unknown diseases radically reduced the local population. The entire structure of society underwent irreversible, fundamental changes, adapting harshly to the new conditions of survival. The old, familiar centers of power quickly emptied out, while new ones began to grow rapidly around strategic logistical hubs. It was a difficult time of colossal social upheaval and the painful formation of a new cultural identity for the region. The map of human settlement on the continent was completely redrawn in just a few short decades. As expected, the victors faced the challenge of governing a territory many times larger than their own homeland. They struggled to build a new administrative system from scratch, relying on the remnants of old structures. The partial integration of local, loyal elites into the new hierarchy became the only way to preserve fragile stability. The complex process of governance became a compromise between the ambitions of the expeditionary force and the harsh realities of a vast country. Bureaucracy began to naturally supplant military command as the political situation in the region stabilized. The brief military campaign smoothly transitioned into a long and complex process of state building. Studying this specific historical episode teaches us the importance of critical thinking in dead-end situations. When standard, familiar algorithms of action cease to work, salvation lies only in non-standard solutions. Analyzing the internal structure of a threat and searching for its hidden vulnerabilities is far more effective than direct, head-on confrontation. This universal principle applies not only to military strategy, but also to the management of any complex processes. The history of Otumba is a vivid illustration of how the quality of planning always trumps the quantity of resources. It is a timeless historical lesson that no system is invincible if one knows where its center lies. Today, looking back on those long-ago events, we clearly see a complex interweaving of ambitions, technologies, and chance. The course of world history very often balances on a very fine line, where a single decision changes the trajectory of human development. Large-scale changes can quite easily be set in motion by a single swift dash of a small group of people across a dusty plain. It is very important to always remember that behind grand historical shifts, there are invariably specific tactical moments. Understanding these hidden moments helps us better grasp the laws of development and the fragility of complex structures. Remembering these events remains the most important key to understanding the mechanisms of global change. What do you think of this story about how a single, precise decision turned the tide of continental history? This striking example clearly demonstrates just how fragile even the most massive and seemingly invincible systems can be. We have clearly seen that cold calculation and courage can overcome any obstacle in the open field. Let us know in the comments which historical strategies, sieges, or subtle tactical maneuvers you'd like to see analyzed in our next videos. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new in-depth analyses.